10 o'clock. Let's get started. But I personally, we're having a little difficulty. Forgot the glasses this morning. So now that I can read what's on this agenda, may I have a motion for the approval of the March 24th, 2022 External Relations Committee meeting minutes? Do I hear a motion?
I'll second it.
Okay. Excuse me, forgot. Let us vote. The motion has passed. First on our agenda, number 2 of the agenda, is a briefing regarding the Riders Advisory Council. Update from Rhonda Allen, Chief Customer Experience Officer. Thank you, Ms. Allen.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Scott, Mr. Greenwood, Ms. Mullinax, and members of the External Relations Committee. I would like to provide just a quick briefing around the activities of the Riders Advisory Council, which was launched in the summer of 2020. Next. We can go to the first slide. Okay. Well, COVID-19 relegated us to mostly virtual meetings during this period of time with this 24-member body, but Marta staff was still able to share a number of presentations with this group, including those around the foundation of Marta on expansion projects as well as rehabilitation projects. The members were also able to participate in some activities in person. We toured the Armor Yard Rail Maintenance Facility, the Integrated Operations Center, and the Emergency Operations Center, and a few of them also acted as transit ambassadors with us during special events. But of course, as the real intent of this council, the group was also able to share their ideas with us via our Q Markets platform. One of those projects that we were able to advance the farthest is the Civic Center crosswalk, signaled crosswalk. That's actually due to be completed later this fall. But there are others projects that we'd like to continue to advance. That's the establishment of a Marta Museum, a refresh of the Ride with Respect video series, as well as little station library hubs at Marta stations. Next, please. But as the RAC progressed from concept to reality, we expected that there were going to be some things that we got right, but then we also realized that there were things that we would need to adjust as we went along. We did notice a decline in attendance among some of the members, which might have been due mostly to the virtual nature of the engagements. We initially set a standard of 75% attendance before we'd ask other members, these members to come off and maybe bring someone else on. But after a while, it just really seemed futile to try to bring on new members in the middle of a term and bring them up to speed. So we didn't really stick to that. But hopefully with the addition of some additional customer experience staff and more in-person meetings, that'll help us reach out to them more. We'll have a little bit more engagement. We'll have staff that'll help to really usher through some of these ideas and projects that they bring to us on Q Markets. And hopefully they'll bring us a better or increased level of attendance with this new body. And again, we do intend to maintain close contact with the inaugural body of RAC members through an establishment of what I have on the screen called the RAC Fellows, but we've kind of changed that and we're leaning more towards the RAC Champions or Marta Champions. So we'll continue to work with this group. And as this group kind of graduates off and the next group comes on, we'll build this collective group of Marta advocates that we can lean on into the future. There are also a small number of that group that will travel with us next month to tour the Stadler plant and give us some ideas or their thoughts around where we are with the rail car procurement and the design of our rail cars. So again, we're happy to continue to maintain close contact with this inaugural body. Next. All right. So again, with the current RAC members terms expiring this month, we advertised for new members in February. As a reminder, anyone who is over the age of 18, not an active Marta employee or a contractor with Marta, or an elected official were able to serve on this body. We used a variety of methods to communicate the opportunity, including news releases, social media channels. We actually paid for some advertisement on Facebook as well. We used our website. We emailed those who applied in 2020 and did not make it, so we asked them to consider reapplying, and a few did. And then we shared, of course, on our individual networks. I believe some board members shared on your networks. We had other elected officials we shared with, and staff also shared on their personal, on their networks. We received 88 applications, and now I'll kind of share with you a little bit more about, what happened there and how we managed to get down to where we are today. Next slide. So the applications were reviewed by a selection committee. 5 of the 7 criteria that we looked at were basically objective, but then there were 2, the expression of interest and their community involvement, more subjective in nature, as we asked them to really share with us in writing how they are involved and what they think they would bring to this body. After we scored all the applicants, we then really tried to take a look and consider other demographics such as ethnicity, income level, education level, age, gender, just to make sure that the body kind of looked like the body of writers that we know today before we made our final selections. So now we'll take a look at the candidate pool and the other demographics of the group that we've selected. Next slide. So again, a majority, more than 58% of the applicants were actually from the city of Atlanta. DeKalb came in, followed with a larger group of 20%, followed by Fulton and Clayton. Very similar numbers when we finalized the pool, or finalized the council members, got down to 30, and a larger number, 43%, came from the city of Atlanta. So again, we tried to, first we looked at, all of the, we scored everybody. We tried to take like the top 5 or 6 from each jurisdiction, looking at the strength of the applications, and this is generally just where we landed. Next. Looking at the ethnicity of all the candidate pool as well as the council members, those were majority of the candidate pool selected a minority ethnicity. And that is the same, the outcome of the member, the general member of the 30. That's how that kind of shaped out as well. All right, next. We'll now get into really the kind of the look and the makeup of the body of 30 that we've invited. Half will be considered in the group of millennial or the Gen Z population. They're 41 or younger. And then so while we have about half that are in that group, we also have the other half. We have members that have said that they've ridden Marta for 30 years or more. So we've got a good group in that age range, a wide range of folks there on the council. On the education level, similar. Most of the applicants were college graduates or had graduate degrees. You'll see that as is shown here. That's how the final council kind of shaped out, but we also have members who are from each range of education levels, right, from high school graduates to those who have doctoral degrees on the council. So they each will bring, hopefully, great value in what they share with us each month. On to income level. Again, a wide variety, and I'll just mention that again, the demographics were optional responses on the application, so we had some areas where folks chose not to provide us with that information, so it's also shown and reflected here. But again, we have a wide range of income levels among the group here as well. About a third of the Riders Advisory Council members use transit as their only means of transportation. Half of them ride the system daily. Let's see, I think a good number, 43% also ride regional services. So it's not just Marta, they travel the region using other bus providers that connect with Marta. So we're happy to have them and have those experiences. About 10% describe themselves as having some level of mobility issues. 2 of the 30 are mobility certified with Marta, and 1, while she rides fixed route mostly, does have a vision impairment. So just a little bit more there. The larger group really this group has a strong community involvement. They're on boards, they volunteer in their neighborhoods. We have about an equal number of folks who consider themselves transit advocates as those who say they've had poor experiences on MARTA and apply so that they can help us to improve the customer experience, and that's what we want. So not everyone on this council is a rah-rah, MARTA, but they do, intent, and one of them mentioned, I don't want to be the person that just complains, I want to help, with some solutions. So look forward to working with those folks as well. Again, while 10% of the folks said that they have some level of disability, we have 7% that are advocates for those with physical and developmental disability, some who have siblings who fall in that category. And then finally, I'll share with you the names of these individuals. We do not have their pictures here. We have them now, but we didn't have them in time to prepare and to place in this presentation. But this is the group of council members that we selected, and you can see here also where in the city that they are from. If you're looking here and you see OFW, under the City of Atlanta, that's Old Fourth Ward, members from Buckhead, Southwest Atlanta, East Atlanta, Downtown Atlanta, Midtown, and the West End. The other areas are probably a little bit more self-explanatory when you look in the parentheses there of where they hail from. And with that, I'll take any questions you have regarding the new body or the process.
Do we have any questions? Yes, Mr. Pond?
Great program. The purpose of this program was to get customer input to improve the system. You mentioned some of the specific things you were doing, but have you gotten feedback where you helped improving the operations or things weren't getting done, such as stations are not being clean or discourteous interfaces, that kind of thing? I'm just curious from an operational standpoint, what kind of feedback you're getting there.
I would say that the feedback that we hear are things that we know about already and that we've been working on. So thankfully, when these things are brought to our attention, we're able to share with them the activities and the initiatives that operations already has underway for station cleaning. But we also are able to, they provide ideas to us like, hey, at this bus stop, you should have more trees, or consider in your new designs having more trees, or having these types of benches, right? So we look for those type things. But yeah, we do have folks that will tell us, hey, station such and such, is dirty. But these are, thankfully, these are things that we're already been working on. So. And when they're out there as transit ambassadors, they have an opportunity to kind of see things and see how the operations flow, and they understand it more. And the responses have been actually pretty positive once they're out there.
Mr. Snyder, did you have a question? No?
All right.
Well,
I have one quick question.
yes, Mr. Ford.
I'm wondering about the wisdom of not including people who don't live in this area who actually do ride MARTA.
Yes. So anyone who lives or works in the area can apply.
Or works in it.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. And we did have one individual who I believe it seems as though he was from Henry County who applied. He just didn't have a very strong application. But we do not exclude anyone who doesn't live or work in the area and who wants, because perhaps they want to. They're part of the group that wants to expand into their neighborhood, and so they are not excluded.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I have one question that may or may not fit within this category, but I'm looking at a text that I received from someone, and the question was, does MARTA offer mobile transit card on Google Pay on Android devices?
We have a mobile ticketing solution that allows them to purchase fare using those devices. So Breeze Mobile, yes.
So they can use an Android device as well?
Yes.
Great. I can now answer that question. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Hearing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will now have a MARTA Reach update from Anthony Thomas, Program Manager, Customer Experience Innovations. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Scott, Mr. Greenwood, Ms. Mullinex, and members of the External Relations Committee. My name is Anthony Thomas, and I am the Program Manager for Customer Experience Innovation here at MARTA. Item number 3 on today's agenda is a briefing to update you on the MARTA Reach on-demand transit pilot program. We last came to this committee in February to discuss the upcoming launch of Martyr Reach. Today's presentation is a midpoint update on the pilot, and we're thrilled to share some exciting developments as we move towards the second half of the pilot program. As a reminder, the Martyr Reach program began on March 1st, so we're about 50% through the 6-month pilot. As of May 6th, we've served about 1,089 trips in the pilot. In the week and a half since, we've carried an additional 392 trips for a total of 1,481 to date. That being said, I have seen that we have had many rides this morning, so that number is higher. The customers taking these trips have waited on average 7 minutes to be picked up, and their trips have taken about 10 minutes. One note about wait times for this type of service. When we calculate wait time, that is from when the trip is requested to when the patron is picked up. And since we've developed the stops to minimize walking, those 7 minutes can really be spent doing things like washing dishes, folding laundry, or catching up with friends and family. The app provides patrons with an estimated time of arrival and live updates of where their Reach shuttle is. That means that pickups can be seamless for both the operator and the patron as well. Next slide, please. This image shows the growth in ridership of the Martyr Reach program. We've been excited to see the continued interest in the program and subsequent increase in ridership. Taking this data at face value, there seems to be additional latent demand that could be unlocked by some changes to the pilot service. Next slide, please. Our partners at Georgia Tech have implemented a survey mechanism for riders of the Reach service. The ages of our riders skews younger, though we have a significant set of riders above the age of 35. The ethnic breakdown of Reach riders matches the breakdown of general Martyr riders in the region as well. The average survey respondent is a young, Black, low/middle income woman with some college education but no degree. Most respondents take transit regularly, and most never drive alone. Next slide, please. Through our trip-specific survey, we've learned that the majority of Reach trips are replacing all or portions of existing transit or walking trips. This indicates that riders are placing a value on the greater flexibility and decreased travel and wait times that the Reach service offers. In addition, it looks as though there has been a small boost in rail ridership due to the program. Some trips taken without rail before the Martyr Reach service are now being taken by a combination of Reach and rail, confirming that there is the existence of that first mile, last mile problem that we're trying to solve. Next slide. Most of the data we've shared so far has been about the service overall, incorporating all 3 service zones. However, we did scope the pilot so that we could determine how on-demand service operates in different environments. This slide provides some ridership and service metrics broken out by zone. One important note is that the Gillum zone has ridership that is comparatively low, which raises a few key questions for the service pilot. Are we serving the right locations? Is there enough demand in the zone? Are the hours of operation working for the potential patrons? Our team has been diving into the ridership data to uncover the answers for how to modify the Martyr Reach service to be as successful as possible. Next slide. Looking forward to the next phase of the Martyr Reach pilot program, we're thrilled to share how we're increasing the reach of the service. A few notes before we get into the details. We've only made revenue-neutral changes to the pilot service. We're changing where the vehicles are, but we are not proposing at this time any hours or days of service changes. We're also committed to maintaining service where it has already been allocated. So all three of the current zones have loyal and frequent riders, and we want to be sure to maintain the service for those riders. Next slide. Okay, so first up is the expansion of the West Atlanta zone. We've actually just implemented this service change on Monday, the 16th. The service now operates in Florida Heights, Collier Heights, and the Dixie Hills neighborhoods. We've also included new transfers at West Lake Station and Bankhead stations. Next slide. Next is the expansion of the Belvedere zone. This was also implemented this past Monday and adds the city of Avondale estates to the current Belvedere zone. Riders will now have direct access to Kensington Station. Next slide. The expansion of the Gillum logistics zone is large and is in reaction to the comparatively low ridership in that area. We developed this expansion to create more connections to destination centers in Clayton County. The new Gillum / Clayton zone will include connections to South Lake Mall, Southern Regional Medical Center, and Clayton State University. Riders will also be able to now transfer to the Route 196. This change will go into effect on May 30th. Next slide. Finally, the team is very excited to begin providing service in the North Fulton area starting on May 30th. The new North Fulton zone will connect to North Point Mall, the Avalon Mixed-Use District, and the Georgia State Alpharetta campus. Riders will be able to connect to other MARTA services like the routes 85, 140, 141, and 142. At Mansell Park and Ride, riders can get frequent fixed-route bus service to North Spring Station to get further into the core of the area. I'd like to extend my gratitude to our partners at the North Fulton CID for their assistance in scoping out this zone expansion. And before moving forward, I'd be remiss to not also personally thank Ezekiel Guza, Corentin Aguin, Charles Rosa, and Emma Pohimus from our planning department. They've assisted us in building these new zones, and they've visited each and every one of these new virtual stops in the 4 expanded zone to confirm that they will work for our patrons, so I thank them. Next slide. As we pivot towards the back half of the REACH pilot program, I wanted to take time to enumerate how we will be evaluating the service. Each of the goals that you see here will be linked to a measurable KPI, either through our operational data or census data, or will be linked to qualitative data through our passenger surveys. When we return to the board at the conclusion of the pilot service, these will be the metrics by which we evaluate the service. Next slide. While the hard data is important, it is also vital to hear directly from our customers on how they are interacting with the service. I won't read all of the feedback that we've heard, but I would like to share one that really struck me. The patron says, "I would sell my car if this was a citywide option. I prefer mass transit to personal vehicles." And I think that this is a great sentiment and exactly kind of the sort of sentiment that we want from this type of first mile, last mile on-demand service. Next slide. Thank you so much for your time today. I'd like to leave you with a quote from City of Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens when speaking at the African American Mayors Association annual meeting. MARTA REACH is all about achieving equity and accessibility in our transportation, and I could not agree more. Next slide. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee, and that concludes my remarks. Any questions?
Do we have any questions for Mr. Thomas?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I have a
Mr.
question. Thank you for the presentation. I think this program is an excellent way to reach those people that are not close to our stations, and we can connect to them. I mean, this can be impactful for those communities. Are there situations where people may call the service but are not in the zone? Do you have any idea of maybe what that looks like and how that is quantified?
Sure. So we don't really have a mechanism in the technology application for folks to make requests if they're outside of the zone. Essentially, you have to make a request from one of the virtual stops that we've identified within the zones. That being said, I personally receive all of the emails from individuals asking about the service, and I can confirm that we do receive questions from individuals that are slightly outside of the zone. For example, I got an email just recently from someone that lives just north of the Gillum Logistics Center that was asking about the service. And so we do receive those, and so I do have kind of a count of where those are coming from, and some of those were actually incorporated into our expansion decisions. For example, there was an individual that lives off of Katie Kerr Drive in Avondale Estates, and I was happy to be able to email them and say we are actually expanding to that area. So I do have that information, and I can provide it if needed.
Well, no, that's just want to know that I'm sure there's some people that are outside the zone that may want to use the service. It's good to know that you can respond to them and know who they are. Then my next question is, on some of these routes, are they multiple stops? Or will you pick up one person and you go to another and bring them into their location?
Definitely. I actually specifically requested that the Georgia Tech team provide that information on what the level of ride sharing is. Yeah. And we're seeing about 10% ride sharing at this point. Okay. As ridership increases, we expect that that number will also increase.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Snyder?
Just one quick, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Thomas, very nice presentation. It's a great program. Quick question about the app. Have you had any complaints about the app, or are there any issues with people being able to use it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what I'll say is that there's always the opportunity to improve when you're developing customer-facing technology. We heard some complaints about some of the accessibility features of the application that actually came from our D&I department, and so we've been working with Georgia Tech to improve that. One of the other things that we've heard is that currently the way the system works is that you have to select a virtual stop on the map to indicate your origin, and then you select a virtual stop on the map to indicate where you want to be taken. And some individuals have expressed kind of some frustration with having to zoom around a map and have a little bit of knowledge on kind of the what the zone looks like in order to make those requests. And so Georgia Tech is actively working on implementing a couple functions to address that issue. The first will be a functionality that will allow individuals to re-request frequent requests. We see lots of people that take the same trip repeatedly, and so the system will be able to essentially have them just click one button and it will make a request for that same origin and destination. So that's one thing that they're working on. And then the second thing that they're working on, which might take a little bit more time, is actually allowing people to input an address and then the system determining what the closest virtual stop is to their location. So they're actively working on those solutions, and those are kind of the biggest pieces of feedback that we've heard about the application.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Floyd?
This is intriguing to me for a lot of different reasons, but Rod said something about a call. You can't call a number and get this service, can you? Or is there a telephone number you can dial?
You actually can. So if you call Marta customer service number, our main customer service, the first thing that you will hear is actually a prompt asking you if you have interest in the Marta Reach program or have interest in booking a ride. You can click 1. If you click 1, then you're directly connected to our Marta Reach dispatch team, and they can actually put in a request for you over the phone.
Okay, so we actually have a dispatch team then? Is that,
Exactly.
Okay, and how many buses are involved in this at any one time?
Yes, so the service operates 16 vehicles at a time.
Okay. And if I understand it right, you can get picked up, if you're in a zone, you have to be in a zone to get picked up, and you have to be going somewhere within that zone.
That's correct.
Is that correct? So
That's
you can't,
correct.
I guess, the things that interest me, I mean, I know you can't answer this, but I don't see where this thing stops. I mean, if it continues to be of interest and successful, I'm wondering how the cost of it seems to me to be relevant, very much so, that how much it's costing us to do these little sections, and then if we double the size of the Belvedere section, what would that impact? And I think one of the things that Reg was talking about is getting information from people that are just outside the area, or being able to somehow to evaluate calls or interest from people that are not there. If that impacts your decision to make it larger, or is it just, it's working here, let's try it a little bigger? Is it as simple as that?
Yeah, so I think for the pilot service, the goal is to learn as much as we can. And so we're making expansions, going to other places so that we can really tap different markets to see how they respond to this sort of on-demand service. I think as we think or look towards a longer-term conversation, that's really going to be dependent on some of the decisions that are made through our bus network redesign process, and really thinking through how this service can work with our fixed route service.
Okay, that seems extremely relevant to me as we begin to talk about redoing the bus program or how we might approach that. That the information that we're gathering here might be very relevant to whoever in the MARTA organization is making decisions about what routes change and what routes don't change. So
Exactly.
anyway, it's interesting to me. I'm not confident enough right now that we got enough information to decide that, but I am interested very much in seeing it expand a little bit. And I would be interested in knowing what the limits are on that at some point in time. I mean, could we double the size of it next month if we wanted to, or are we 2 years away from making a significant increase? And I'm not looking for an answer necessarily for those questions right now, but I do see this as an integral part of this bus route evaluation thing that we're going through. And so anyway,
Yes, sir.
nice job.
Thank you.
Mr. Frierson?
Yeah, I just want to say that I really enjoyed watching the Zoom presentation of the videos that you do on the program that kind of explains the user's experience with it. I think that's a great way to communicate to the community how that service works and what benefits that it brings. So keep moving forward. That's some great videos. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
If I can just build on to what Mayor. was there
I do
something?
have one question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I wanted to make sure everyone had an opportunity to ask their question. Because it does, I agree with Mayor Floyd that this seems to be a service that we will expect to expand upon. And I think during the briefing, Mr. Ash and I both had concerns about the drivers being actual Marta employees. And especially when I think of HR 3684, the Jobs and Infrastructure Act, which assures that we will have jobs. Are the drivers participating now Marta employees?
So the operators for the pilot service are contract operators through our Marta Mobility service.
Do we anticipate expanding and the drivers become Marta employees?
I think what I would say, and feel free, Mr. General
Sure.
Manager.
Yep.
I think what I would say is that we're trying to, through the pilot, learn as much as we can, and that will definitely be part of the decision-making as we look towards a longer-term program.
Yeah, that's a great response. We have, when this thing started, when the pilot started, one of the first things we did was assess whether or not our own employees could actually provide the pilot. And if you recall, it was at a time when having trouble providing full service for our regular fixed route service. So it was a burden we really couldn't put on the system with any amount of reliability. So we did go with a workforce that already serves MARTA in the contract mobility space. It is a pilot. We are assessing feasibility and viability, and that's part of the assessment is how expensive will this service be? And that may depend on the workforce that we choose. So if it turns out that the workforce that is locked into this program is too expensive, then maybe the zone has to shrink, or maybe it's deemed non-viable in total. But we have to see what comes of that. And the other thing I would say is, building on Mayor Floyd's point, is that when we started the bus network redesign, it was around the same time we were talking about MARTA Reach, and the architects of both of those programs, be it Ms. Allen and Jarrett Walker, we had a group discussion about how these two things have to work together. So the reason we launched Reach at the point we did was so that we had information about how viable it would be as a tool for part of our bus network redesign. So it really will complement that system.
So now I didn't hear answer to my question about whether or not we intend to expand to make sure the drivers are MARTA employees. So I want to just put it out there.
Sure.
That is a consideration we need to have.
And I'll reiterate, it was our first consideration. The ATU drivers were not available in volume to do it as a pilot, but as we assess the pilot, that will be one of the considerations, is what will it cost and how well can we staff it with ATU. That's our first choice workforce.
Well, right, now I understand that we're in the process of hiring and bringing in
Sure.
new employees.
Yes.
So with that being said, I still wanted to put it out there that this is something that's being looked at because of the fact that I know there have been issues with ATU, and they've expressed those issues with other elected officials.
Yes.
So we need to make sure that that is in consideration.
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Thomas? Hearing none, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other matters to come before the External Affairs Committee? Hearing none, seeing none, this committee is adjourned. Thank you and have a great day.
All right, I want to call to order the Audit Committee meeting for May the 19th, 2022. Board members, you have in front of you the minutes of the meeting from March 24th, 2022. Are there any additions or corrections to those minutes? Hearing none, is there a motion to adopt the minutes or approve the minutes? I guess we do that on this machine, yeah, okay. Somebody moved and nobody seconds yet. There's a second, all right. Please vote for adoption of the minutes. Okay, looks like it passed. Nobody objects to the minute. Okay, and Emil, you staying down there, Emil? Okay. All right, so the first item on the agenda today is the Marta FY 2022 external audit engagement, Crow LLP, and we have some representatives from that firm here today. So please.
Yeah, good morning, Chair Floyd. Good morning, Mr. Greenwood, and good morning to the directors. My name is Brad Shelley. I'm an audit partner at Crow, and glad to be here with you this morning. I have with me Catherine Brothers, manager who also works on the audits. And what we want to do this morning is just go through a few slides with you all. We're really kind of at the planning stage of the audit and wanted to provide an oversight or an overview of the audit process for this year and some of the items we'll look at, some of the things that we'll consider, and also get any questions or feedback that we have from you all. So if you want to go ahead and advance the slide. And so what we have on the agenda here, like I said, we'll go through just some quick introductions. We'll talk about the actual deliverables that we'll be providing at the end of the audit process. We'll touch on the audit approach from a high level. We'll talk about the timeline. We'll get some inquiries of the committee, and then update you on a couple of emerging issues that won't impact this year's audit, but just wanted to keep you aware of those as we move forward. So if you advance the slide. So as I mentioned, I already introduced myself and Catherine. Some of the other key team members from our side is Stacy Kernow, a senior staff. We have other staff as well who work both on the financial statement audit and now on the IT audit as well, as we do look at some of the financially significant systems there as well. And then equally important, we have a subcontractor from Benford Brown and Associates. Tim Watson is the partner there. They are an MBE entity, and so they are a good partner with us. They've worked with us for all 4 previous years of the audit, and they do a lot of the work alongside us. If you advance the slide from here, I'm going to have Catherine talk about the audit deliverables.
Yeah, so on this slide, we have a list of the audit deliverables for this year. Will look similar to years past. This first grouping up here, we have the auditor's report, which we will issue an opinion. So a management letter, which will communicate any internal control deficiencies, if any arise. Then finally, the SAS 114 letter, which includes certain required communications with the board. This middle section here is in relation to the uniform guidance audit that we will perform. So we've got 2 different opinions there, and that last bullet point is a note that there will be an in relation to opinion on the CFA, the Schedule of Expenditures Federal Awards. And then the last 2 items here are sometimes forgotten, but a little bit smaller than the first 2 sections on the slide. We have the agreed upon procedures report for the items that are submitted to the National Transit Database on an annual basis. And then we also will provide an electronic certification on the data collection form when the information from the CFA and the Uniform Guidance Audit does get uploaded to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. You can go to the next slide.
And on the NTD, we were actually just talking about how that'll be reported, the new service, the new pilot program service, because I think that'll be something that may be a new mode for the NTD reporting. So just an interesting side note as we were listening to the other presentation.
Well, if I interrupt you just a minute, because I don't understand this at all. Agreed upon procedures report on National Transit Database Federal Funding Allocation Statistics form.
Yeah, so.
What does that mean?
So that means what the FTA requires every large transit agency to report certain data annually. So all the larger transit agencies are required to report information on ridership, on operating expenses, on certain capital information. So there's a variety of information that's reported annually, and that's required to be submitted 4 months after the end of the year. So by October 31st, Marta is required to submit all that information to the National Transit Database. And
what is it? Who agreed on this? I mean, do we have a choice in this?
You don't have a choice on it.
So somebody else is agreeing on it somewhere else,
yes.
then, right?
And that's a good point that kind of leads me to the next point, I guess, is the FTA also requires certain procedures. So there is a set list of procedures. I think it's about 26 currently, different procedures that all of the large transit agencies are required to have performed on an annual basis. So you don't have any say in that. You all didn't really agree to it. FTA agreed to it on your behalf. So
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Let them know we appreciate them doing that for us too.
All right, so the next two slides here are going to go over our audit approach and our audit methodology. So the audit does start with our annual risk assessment. During that time in the planning phases, we'll go over your organization, talk about performance metrics, your objectives as a business and an organization as a whole, and then from there we'll really coordinate what our audit objectives are going to be, go through that risk assessment, identify what those key financial statement areas for us to evaluate will be. We will also identify the concept of audit risk and materiality, so we will be setting materiality thresholds during that time as well. As we go through that process, one thing to remember is the purpose of the financial statement audit and compliance audit will be for the auditors to provide an opinion on the financial statements and compliance. Then obviously management is responsible for the actual preparation of those financials, with the audit committee really coming in for quality control to assess internal controls and compliance at a high level. So during this process, we will be looking at the role of internal controls in the organization. That does factor into our audit risk assessment, and then also we will be testing some of those internal controls during our processes. As we move through to field work and testing, we will start to look at some of those account balances that we did identify through our risk assessment process. We'll perform those substandard audit testing procedures, review management's prepared financial statements, and then start to prepare those year-end communications and deliverables that we spoke about on the last slide. And then finally, in the reporting and filing phase, we'll complete that financial statement review and then discuss the results of our audit with the board and any other key stakeholders. You can go to the next slide. Continuing with this, as I mentioned, we will look into internal controls. We will test some of those for operating effectiveness. And then a big item this year will be the implementation of new standards. So we've listed all of the new Gatsbys on this slide here. I won't read through each of them in complete detail, but the big one is obviously going to be Gatsby 87, the new lease standard. We have already started to discuss this with management at Marta. Just started discussing it years ago, and now are getting more into the specific conversations about specific leases, as well as how the implementation of that standard has been going up until this point.
Yeah, I think that's one that's been in process. We've had discussions for probably 3 years going back on this one, just because of as we talked about, I think at the last meeting when we were presenting the financial statements and the other reports at the end of the FY21 audit, there's a lot of data collection that goes into this and a lot of different people throughout Marta that are involved. So it's much more than just the finance team doing the accounting for it. It's gathering all the information from the various departments to make sure that the finance team can evaluate all of those contracts and determine whether they're leases and whether they are leases that qualify under Gatsby 87. So that's been a long time coming. It's been delayed due to COVID. The required implementation was delayed a year. So it's finally upon us. From talking with the finance team, I feel pretty confident that they are ready for that they have a process in place. They've worked through that, and so they've been asking some questions on specific transactions or specific leases. They've asked some questions about those, so I feel like they are fairly prepared for that.
Remind us what type leases you're talking about here, or?
Yeah, so it's really any type of lease that is you are a lessee or a lessor. So previously there were operating leases or capital leases, and depending on the type of lease, it was treated differently. So most what you saw was operating leases, and those leases were just expensed, right? As you incurred the expense, it was recorded as expense, or as you earned the rent, that was recorded as revenue. Now, generally speaking, all of those leases will be treated more similar to a capital lease, where you will have if you're in the lessee position, you'll have a right to use asset, and then you'll have a lease liability that corresponds, and those generally are going to be a similar amount. So don't expect there to be a significant net impact, but you'll see a larger amount of assets and a larger amount of liabilities come on the books this year for all those leases. And then similarly for the lessor situations, you'll have a similar type transaction.
So you say you do not expect a change, a net in the overall look at the financial condition of Marta as a result of this change?
Not a significant net difference. I think there may be some net difference just due to potentially some amortization or some things like that. There may be some slight differences there, but I think generally speaking, the amount of assets that you put on will be fairly similar to the amount of liabilities that show up.
Sorry.
But those assets and liabilities could be very material. I'm not sure. I'm sort of speculating, but I would guess that those would be material, but I don't think the net impact would be material.
Would you say that to any transit agency that you were talking to? The same? Would you make that same statement?
Generally speaking, I mean, we work with a number of them, and a few of them have a different setup, and but I would say for the larger ones, like you all, I would say yes. That's the way. What I'm expecting to see is probably a material asset and a material liability come on, but probably not much difference from a net standpoint.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so moving forward, another item of note over the past few years has been the various funding sources as a result of COVID-19. So our audit will focus again this year looking at CARES funding, CRISA funding, ARPA funding, and evaluating those both from a financial statement perspective as well as through our uniform guidance audit as well.
Rod,
And then,
I'm sorry, Rod, did you have a question? Did I miss you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Or you want to skip it, or you want to ask?
Yeah, let me just go ahead and get the analysis on the lease, because, we have hundreds of leases out there, and I'm guessing, I guess the question I asked is, as you begin to open this up, are you looking at all leases, or is there a dollar value that you say we're just too insignificant for us to look at, or are there certain ones that you're going to categorize? I know it's a pretty big area to look, so.
Our recommendation has been for management to obtain and review all leases and really gather that information. That's a common question that we get is, can we put a threshold on it? And it's really tough to say, because if you have 1,000 smaller leases, does that 1,000 smaller leases add up to a large amount that becomes material? And the answer it may be yes in that situation. So our recommendation has been gather everything, understand what you have, and then you can make some determinations on, okay, these maybe are small enough, we're not going to mess with those, and so we can provide some guidance with them, and we have been providing some guidance as we go through, but our initial request is go gather everything, and then make some decisions from there.
okay, and the last item on this slide is just a list of some examples of some traditional risk areas that we have viewed in the past, cash, capital assets, items like pension or debt, and then obviously significant revenue areas, for example, grant revenue, maybe tax revenue as well. And then we can go to the next slide. So we come here to our timeline. We've constructed this to be similar to the timeline of prior periods. Interim field work did begin in April and lasted for about 2 to 3 weeks. So we have completed our interim audit procedures, and then we are looking forward now to our year-end audit procedures. IT audit is going to start in July, with the following month being the year-end financial statement and uniform guidance audit. So we're anticipating a draft of the financial statements in around mid-October, and then about a week from there, we will provide our first comments back to management. We did mention the NTD procedures earlier. As that report is due at the end of October, typically the procedures surrounding that occur in the last 2 or so weeks of October, with us providing that final report by October 31st. And then in early November, we'll deliver those final financial statement reports with the audit committee meeting being in mid-November. And then the final ACFR reports to come in December. All right, and next slide.
And just to distinguish there, because that may be a little confusing. Historically, we provided the financial statements. You have a basic financial statements. That's what we are providing along with the other deliverables that we talk about in the November meeting. Then the ACFR, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, that takes those basic financial statements and then adds on a introductory section and a statistical section. And so that usually doesn't happen until a little later, because some of the information and the statistical information you don't have yet. It may come from the county or from other sources, and so that usually takes a little bit longer. All that information is unaudited, so it doesn't really have any impact on the audit. It's just an additional part that makes up that annual comprehensive financial report. From here, we wanted to just touch on a few things. So first, we appreciate all the input and the questions you've asked thus far. That's always helpful and engaging. We also want to inquire about any other concerns that you may have, any questions about the audit process that you may have, anything you want us to look at in particular. Those are all things that if you have comments or questions on those now, we'd take those. I also wanted to mention the way that we go through the fraud process. And so I get a lot of questions on fraud and how are we planning to test for fraud and identify fraud, and really there's kind of a fine line there, right? So we do a number of procedures. We make a number of inquiries of not only the audit committee, but members of management, different members within the different employees within the finance department, trying to understand if they have any concerns, any suspicions of any fraud, anything that's came up. Talk to the internal audit department, obviously, as well, to see maybe what has been reported, if anything. But we don't plan our audit procedures to identify all instances of fraud. It's just not part of, we aren't doing a forensic audit. Under the financial statement audit, we are trying to identify any material instances of fraud, and so that's the way that we approach that. So again, if any committee members become aware of anything, obviously you report it through the hotline as normal, but feel free to reach out to us specifically if you have any concerns. I think our contact information is in here at the end, so feel free to reach out. And obviously we would do the same. If we identify anything, we'll be sure to reach out to the committee and make you aware of that in advance of the meeting. If you go to the next slide, again, just kind of going further into this, these are some risk areas that we look at. I would say these are general risk areas for most entities, and definitely in looking at transit agencies. So these aren't specific concerns that we think you have misappropriation of assets. These are just general concerns in areas that we try to make inquiries about, and if we are able to do some testing procedures around. So misappropriation of assets, undisclosed related party transactions or relationships, unauthorized employee compensation or benefits, loss of funds due to unauthorized access. This one becomes more and more of a concern as more things happen electronically, right, and more things are done through email, and so we see more hacking and phishing schemes coming up. Again, we don't do cybersecurity testing over that. We do testing over the financially significant systems, but we don't test your entire IT system. loss of personal or sensitive information due to data breaches and then misapplication of restricted funds. So those are some of the things that we try to be aware of and some risks that we've identified and wanted to just communicate to the committee.
It's interesting about you don't audit our IT.
Not the entire system, no.
And I'm interested as to whether you would have an opinion about whether that ought to be something that's done. If you don't do it, who would do that? Or is that an internal responsibility?
Yeah, so it's a combination. But to answer your first question, yes, I definitely recommend having it doesn't have to necessarily be an audit, but I would say you should have testing done over a number of different areas in IT. So, and I think you do have a lot of testing done. I know internal audit does some testing, and then I believe you've had some other testing in the past. But there are things where you can attempt to hack or do phishing schemes kind of through a test model, right? Some social engineering, I think is what it's called. You can do different tests that way. You can attempt to hack into the system. A lot of different testing in those ways. That's stuff those are all services that we provide, but that's really outside the scope of the financial statement audit. So if needed, we would be happy to do that. But I think you have had that done historically. I don't know where you're at in the most recent times that it's been performed, but I believe when we've inquired in the past, those are services that have been done.
Yeah, well, these guys do a good job, I
Right.
feel like. And
Yeah.
I'm not smart enough to know whether they're doing a good job or not, quite honestly.
Yes.
But anyway, Dean?
Yeah, hey, Dean Malles, AGM of Information Security. We do. We've got 2 penetration tests or ethical hacking coming up over the next couple of months that we're scheduling. We do run phishing tests regularly. So we do a lot of this cybersecurity testing that you're inquiring about. And we also do one-off testing on systems when we see vulnerabilities that need to be addressed.
And Dean, just to elaborate, is it fair to say that these are objective third-party enabled tests?
They are. So the penetration testing that we're going to be doing is 2 third parties. We're doing one on the new rail cars that are coming in, so we're going to be thoroughly testing those. And then the other one, we're doing our enterprise side as well, another third party that's doing that. And then some of the stuff we do our own on some of the internal things that might pop up.
You might elaborate a little more on the penetration test. That sounds a little questionable to me, but.
It is, when he said ethical hackers, so we hire hackers to see
Okay.
what they can do with our system. One of the things that we're going to be doing in this test is not only testing the security on those systems, but seeing what my team sees and what it doesn't see. Because really, eventually it's going to happen, and the goal is that we catch it quickly so that we can contain it.
Bill, our grandkids our grandkids can explain that to us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're going to need that.
Feel free to grab me, and I can go into some more depth.
No, I feel very confident in the work that you all are doing in regards to what you've told us in the past about this. And I just, as Al alluded to, I just am not smart enough to figure that stuff out. So I'm relying entirely on somebody to say, yeah, this is okay. So some of these younger board members might feel a little better about doing that than I do. But anyway, thanks.
You're welcome.
If you go ahead and advance the slides. So the last things we wanted to cover was just, again, some emerging issues and really just 2 things to keep in mind for right now. Gatsby 91, conduit debt obligations. I think at this point in time, this one won't really impact you. But just to keep it out there, that is something that'll be implemented next year if you do end up with any conduit debt between now and then. And then Gatsby 96, the subscription-based technology agreements, I think I touched on this a little bit in the fall as well. This one kind of goes along with Gatsby 87 and the leases in that a lot of times as you're evaluating the contracts and the different lease agreements, you'll come across some that don't fall under Gatsby 87, but they instead fall under this. Think about like cloud-based computing arrangements or different things such as that, where you have a subscription for some type of cloud service or computing service. And so it's a little bit different than a lease, The accounting treatment will be fairly similar, but it is, it's an area, again, as we talk about technology, it's growing enough that the Gatsbys have decided to come out with a separate specific statement on it to explain how to record those types of transactions. So again, that's not until FY23. And if you advance the slide one more, I think that's just our contact information. So again, happy to take any additional questions you have at this time, but that concludes our presentation.
Al?
There are a lot of moving parts here, and I understand that. And I'll give you an example. We talked about fraud, and that tends to get a lot of the public attention, but in reality, financially, fraud is a very small risk from a financial standpoint. So my question is, if you had to pick 2 or 3 areas that pose the greatest risk for a transit agency, what would that be in your area of the audit?
Are you talking from a fraud standpoint or just some
No,
of the
I'm talking about
risk
from a
overall?
global standpoint, financial standpoint, global financial standpoint.
Yeah, so probably some of the higher risk areas is obviously always revenue. So any kind of revenue recognition is one, especially with, you know, the additional grant funds that are coming in. Now, I will say along those lines, fortunately for transit agencies, all of that funding is pretty unrestricted, right? It's for pretty much any operating expense. So there's less of a concern there that you're spending it on, you know, unallowable costs. But revenue recognition just in general across all revenue streams is an important risk area for us. Anything in the capital areas, so especially with larger agencies like yours who have a lot of capital projects going on, that's probably another higher risk area where we spend a lot of time at is looking at those, whether it's capital additions or whether it's projects that are ongoing over multiple years. So those are probably 2 of the biggest areas. Obviously, cash investments, that's always a higher risk area. Cash is king, right? So that's obviously an area that is of higher risk as well.
Any other questions for Catherine or Brad? No? Well, thank you, guys.
Thank
We
you.
look forward to a very positive report sometime soon, but,
Thank you.
and I know the November date is critical, and we'll know all of you will want to make sure you're here for that report, so. And I think, Amelia, you're up next with the internal audit activity briefing.
Yes, sir. Mr. Floyd, Mr. Greenwood, members of the Marta Audit Committee meeting, good morning. My name is Emil Zanov, the AGM of Internal Audit. Thank you for the opportunity to give you a brief update of the internal audit activities for the 3rd fiscal quarter of Marta's fiscal year, January to the end of March of 2022. Next slide, please. During that period, the operational audit team issued 4 operational audit reports. The good news is that none of them was rated as high risk. All 4 reports were rated as need attention, which is 1 level below. I'll focus on the 2 audits that had significant findings identified. The first one that you see on the screen is the inventory audit. 2 findings were recorded in the audit. One was related to improvements in the physical security of some of the storerooms to deter potential fraud. Now, I want to make it very clear that during our sampling procedures, no fraud was identified. Having said that, we want to remove the opportunity, ability, and temptation for people to commit theft in the future, and we made some recommendations accepted by management. The second finding relates to inaccurate records for various bulk fluids that were identified, and management is working on implementing better procedures to match physical inventory of bulk fluids to the accounting records. The other audit with the findings of significant nature was related to the new rail car procurement. There were 3 findings there. One was related to improving the billing procedures. The next one was a more robust use of the risk register as part of the project management process, which is a critical project management tool. And the third area that that needed improvement was related to regular and frequent updates of the program management plan going forward, another critical element in any project management process. Let's move to the next slide, please. These audits were discussed in prior audit committee meetings and reported. The first one around the non-revenue vehicle use, we had a number of findings, and the due date for those is the end of June. Management has been working, and George has made me aware of the steps taken there to remediate those findings. We're going to give them until the end of June to actually fix it. At this point in time, I feel optimistic, and I'll report during the July Audit Committee meeting where they stand on each one individual finding. Is it green or is it yellow? Going down to the capital improvement program, this has been on the slide for a while. Our latest engagement and communication with the capital program office and the CPMO, they requested us to extend the deadline to the end of May, just because they were very involved in developing the capital budget for fiscal year 23 and helping management to communicate the capital budget to the various different jurisdictions and constituents, which I can certainly understand as a business person. So we'll engage with them again post the end of May, just to verify where they are with those 10 items that need to be closed. They have been doing work, but in internal audit, sometimes we have to be black and white. You either cross the finish line or you don't cross the finish line. And if you're in the final stretch, you're still a few feet away. So we're going to continue to monitor very diligently as to when and how they finish and cross the finish line. And then bus maintenance, they have until August to implement better processes in one of the areas around predictive maintenance. I'd like to move on to the next slide, and with the risk of belaboring the point around information security and auditing IT systems, our audit plan for fiscal 22, our current fiscal year, was entirely focused on cybersecurity and cybersecurity audits. I'll focus on this particular quarter. We focused on auditing the remediation of 2 previous pen testings that were done in the past. One was the TCSN, or the train control system pen testing. We're still in field work. We're still looking at whether the findings of those external reports were actually implemented. The next one was the enterprise penetration testing, which was done in 2018. We reviewed the report back then. We reviewed what recommendations were made, and we identified a number of areas that are yet to be fixed. Those areas have been discussed with management, and I would ask for a little bit of grace and mercy from you to allow me not to go into the details, because these are very highly security sensitive areas, and I would prefer not to go into the details of those as I would normally do on other audits. We also continue to monitor and work with IT on 3 items around the previous password management audit. I'm hoping that we'll be able to clear some of those by the next audit committee meeting, but I'll continue to report because my people are very, very deeply involved into some of these systems that I won't mention that need to be improved. Next slide. From previous periods, we're tracking a couple of items. The train control system and SCADA cybersecurity audit from a couple of years ago. 4 of the items were closed and 2 are still in the process. George and I meet probably once a month, I would say, for updates. We met last week. They've asked me to extend those 2 dates by, I think, a month and a half, because the implementation of both of these items that you see depends on our contract with Alstom. They have to do it, actually. And I think we can see the finish line, but we got to cross it, if I can use figurative speech. So we'll be reporting again in the July Audit Committee meeting, but I'm I'm optimistic that we'll be able to close these final 2 items and be able to remove this audit from this slide, if you will. The last item, which you have seen before, relates to old operating systems. We have some in our environment. I know there's work that's being done, but we haven't really crossed the finish line there as well, and we'll continue to report this until we actually get rid of those old systems. From a security standpoint, we really don't want to have old routers. We don't want to have old operating systems. We want to replace those and refresh those. So a lot of work, Mr. Floyd, being done in auditing IT systems, a lot of hours spent there, a lot of hours educating our auditors and myself on the latest and greatest vulnerabilities and trends as it relates to cybersecurity. Just given the global political and security environment, it remains a topic of focus for us. Next slide, please. The contract audit group produced 14 reports, most of them low risk, one needs attention. The savings identified were around $9,000. We had, at the end of March, 13 audits that we were working on. As a reminder, we continuously receive audit requests in the contract audit group, and we turn them around as quickly as we receive them. So these numbers vary from quarter to quarter, but approximately 14, 15, 16 audits per quarter that we get and we produce out of that team. Next slide, please. Moving over to our fraud investigation process, we received 4 allegations during the quarter. One of them was related to operations management. We referred those to bus operations. They did the investigation. We reviewed their investigation report to make sure they did a quality job. That allegation was determined to be unsubstantiated. We have 3 complicated and active investigations. One caller alleged that a director had paid for services that were not delivered and knowingly circumvented one of our internal controls. The other one, a supervisor was alleged to have allowed people to violate our safety policy by working in a restricted area without proper certification. We're also investigating that one within internal audit. And then the final one, a caller alleged an employee was receiving or maybe receiving payments from vendors. After the initial review by internal audit, we referred that investigation to police, and they're actively interviewing people to come to a conclusion. I'm hoping to be able to close these by the end of June. We had 1 investigation from the prior period. We're wrapping that up, and we have interviewed a large number of employees on the last bullet point. I kind of know what the conclusion is, but we have a few things to wrap up, and I'll report it next time. Next slide. Mr. Floyd, this concludes this briefing, and I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, any questions for Emil about anything we've heard? This section, Reg?
Mr. Floyd?
Reg?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question about your contracts audit group. What exactly do you do in terms of auditing contracts?
Okay. Briefly, and I'll oversimplify it a little bit for the sake of time, but we review many of the contracts that we receive before we sign them. We try to do that before they actually get to the board, but typically we review cost and overhead rates based on FAR reviews. This is a significant chunk of our work today, especially as we engage in this very extensive capital program. So labor rates and overhead rates, which is, most of our contracts. But we also review a large single or sole source procurement. So when there is no competition, let's say there is an exclusive contract for whatever reason, we couldn't bid it and compete it, that gets to internal audit to determine that the price is fair and reasonable. So we either do cost or price analysis. We also perform reviews on big change orders in certain contracts. At the end of major construction initiatives or projects, we do closeout reviews. And those called the 50, 60, $100 million contracts that we have to review. So these are the nature of the contract audits that we produce for the authority.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And one follow-up question. So let's say it's a construction contract review. You've reviewed the agreement, you think it's fair. Do you review the work that's being done under the contract to determine if your review was adequate? In other words, is there kind of a ongoing analysis of your review to determine if you're catching what you need to catch?
Meaning deliverables versus spending?
Right, yes.
We do on some of them, but that's very judgmental. So we can't review every contract, but if we see a contract that may be exposed to a significant risk, we might review that. But that's a minority of contracts. So typically, we will not review every contract for deliverables versus plan.
Right.
But we might catch some of them in our audit work.
Reg, I'm interested in your question here because are you talking about performance of the contract?
Right.
Or just the payments?
I'm talking about performance, and so
Performance.
when you're looking at a contract, and you say, well, this looks like a fair contract, the price is okay, but then you get a contractor who goes in and makes 20 change orders as a part of their work, then it's like, well, wait a minute, we need to reevaluate either the contractor or the actual contract itself. Maybe there's not enough in it to really get the work done. So my point is only that in terms of doing the analysis on the front end, there has to be ongoing analysis during the process and at the end to make sure that you're properly evaluating it in the front, because we don't want to overpay because we're constantly being change ordered.
Correct. And we
Doing the
review the change orders, and that's
Right.
when we get involved in what happened.
Right.
Kind of a
I
analysis.
think from a performance standpoint, this guy right here is the one that's is responsible for that.
Yes, no, I
I
understand.
mean-
But I assume that if you do contract analysis, you make a recommendation. Contract looks good to us, it's good to go ahead and go with it. And I assume that's even before you do the RFP, if it's not a sole source contract.
So if it's a competitively bid process, we may not audit that because there's an element of competition.
Right.
Like in an RFP, but let's say in your example, there's an RFP and there is only one respondent to the RFP,
Right.
that will be considered a single source contract that will get to us because there was no competition, even though there was an RFP. But if there was like 5 responsive and responsible bidders and there was competition and the process was followed, then we will not audit that.
Right. Okay. Well,
I hope I answered your
yeah, you
question.
did. I
Okay.
appreciate it. It's good.
Well, I think it needs more discussion at some point in time. Maybe not now, because I think that involves legal. I think it involves operations and the capital people, but that's a very interesting question and a point that you're trying to get to there. So anyway,
I'll speak a little bit more about that when we get to the audit plan in the next briefing.
Great. Thank you, sir.
are there any other questions about the internal audit activity briefing? If not, Emil, the Marta fiscal year 2023 internal audit plan.
Can we switch the presentation? Great. Mr. Floyd, this is the time of the year on our calendar where I come and present the draft audit plan for the following fiscal year. And I appreciate that opportunity. So I'll lay out a little bit of the context for how we developed the audit plan, and then I'll briefly touch on some of the major themes or areas within the audit plan. Next slide, please. We develop the audit plan on an annual basis, and really the idea is to make sure that we capture all the major risks and controls which are impacting the achievement of Marta's objectives as an organization, and also to create a transparent record of the internal audit plan. The plan that you're going to see today is not intended to be a comprehensive, detailed work program. We develop that for each audit engagement, but you're going to see the major areas that will be audited. The other thing that's important in any organization that's mature from an audit perspective is that The audit plan can change from time to time throughout the year based on new risks. So what you see today is kind of the intent of the audit plan, but if we see major new risks pop up, I'll have to come back to you and say, hey, I need to substitute this audit for this new audit because the risk here is greater. And then finally, we develop our plan based on assessment of strategic, operational, financial, compliance, and fraud-related risks. The last one is based not so much on materiality, but it's part of the auditing standards that I have to follow, so I have to do it. So, next slide, please. This is a little bit about how we go through the process of developing the audit plan. In the March and April timeframe, we interview a significant number of C-suite members at Marta, EMT members and directors. We review past audits and fraud investigations. We look at the general industry risk within the transit industry. We also look at the materiality and the importance of the organizations throughout the authority. In the month of April, we digest and synthesize a significant amount of input and create the draft audit plan. And in the month of May, which is where we typically have an audit committee meeting, I present the draft of the next fiscal year's audit plan. The idea here is for us to come here in May, for you to provide your feedback, if any, so that July 1st, I need to be able to hit the ground running without any delay. July 1st, we need to be ready with the first wave of audits. So that's kind of the cadence every year of, the cycle of history. We continuously run, we never stop. Next slide, please. Consistent with prior years, in the area of information technology, we have planned 6 audits. We have planned 12 audits in the operational audit space. Our contract audits come as they come. Typically, we have about 60, 70 per year, but I can never really forecast the exact number of contract audits. And then the fraud investigations come in as they come in. I can't predict how many we will have. We have been, I don't want to say slammed, that may not be the right word, but we've had an increased activity on the fraud hotline in the last several months. I'm happy to say that I'm finally fully staffed in the information technology audit group. We were operating at a 66% labor capacity. It was not easy to produce the audit plan in FY22, but I finally hired the senior information technology auditor, so I'm feeling pretty good about next slide, please. The 6 audits in our information technology audit plans. So we do try to scrub really well and audit our technology environment and our information security environment. In the current fiscal 22, all of our audits were in cybersecurity. Next year, 4 of the 6 are in the areas of cybersecurity, just because this remains a super high area of risk. We have all kinds of global tensions, wars, etc. So we'll continue to focus on the area of cybersecurity. These are the first 4 audits. The last 2 audits were kind of shifting the needle a little bit towards more of a support of critical IT infrastructure. And that's where we're going to look at the IT support of critical enterprise applications and systems, and also what is the production support after Alstom hands over the train control system to Marta. So kind of staying focused on cybersecurity, but moving the needle a little bit on production support as well. Let's switch over to the next slide. These are the first 6 of the 12 operational audits, and I'll maybe zero in on the second one, which relates to the question I received. I called it contract compliance and deliverables. We won't be able to look at every contract, but we will risk assess the risk in various different contracts and their impact on the authority. We'll pick maybe 2 or 3 of them, and we'll do what you just described, Mr. Snyder. We'll look at their, what's happened versus what was built, and make a statement that we'll report to the audit committee. Another area that we've never looked at is the area around transit-oriented development. Very important area for Marta, both from a revenue and image and brand level perspective, so we'll review that one. We'll look at the new rail car procurement again, but more around invoice compliance and controls and, actuals to budget delivery. Next slide, please. The one audit I'll probably highlight here is attracting and retaining employees. Every executive that I spoke with, this was their top concern in the agency, and when I talk to my peers, I probably know every head of internal audit in town. That's at the top of their risk register as well. Attracting and retaining employees. So this is going to be one of the areas that we'll examine with the methodology of internal audit. So just wanted to point that out. Very high priority strategic risk for us. We have a couple of compliance audits at the bottom. So 12 audits mapped to the various different priorities of the authority. We tried to kind of map each audit to one or more of Marta's organizational priorities. Next slide. And then we'll have to implement that and make it happen. So with this concludes my briefing on the audit plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Emil? Mr. Pont?
Yes, going back to the HR issue, retention of employees, and this came up in our session last week with the budget and all the issues. It seems to me HR should have a system that when an employee goes out of the door, that they are dropped in several categories, whether they're terminated, they leave on their own, better job, and move out of town. And to me, that evaluation should be structured and come from HR, and then you guys should review it. I'm not sure, I'm not trying to set up a war between the two of you, but I'm just curious how you plan on looking at this, because that information can be very valuable.
I completely agree with you, Mr. Pont, and that's one of the areas that we'll actually look at because there is a category that we feel when the employee exits the authority. So this is captured in Oracle, and we can certainly look at it from an audit perspective. There is also many organizations out there engage in exit interviews with the employees so that they can actually receive verbal feedback, which can be very valuable. But there is also a host of other tools that organizations use to attract, number one, and number two, then retain employees. And we'll be looking at those as well. So what you just described will be one of probably a dozen elements that we would be reviewing.
But my question, I guess, is who owns this? Does HR own it, or is audit looking into this? Because to me, it starts with HR. They should own the systems and be responsible for the detail work. That's just my opinion. So.
All of the processes are strategic and operational in nature, and HR owns the strategy, the execution of the strategy, and the process. But what we want to examine is whether we are actually doing what we're saying we're doing, or should we do more. So for instance, I'll just pick a hypothetical example. Let's say hypothetically, the HR policies that says that every employee has to undergo an exit interview. Are we actually doing those exit interviews, and are we collecting the intelligence from those exit interviews, right? So we'll go through that, and hopefully this will be an insightful audit that will bring some value to the organization. We can also review some best practices from other agencies as well.
Okay, any other questions? I have a few quick things. I mean, one, and I think this, but I'm not sure it's right, is that what you do in this organization is required under the Marta Act. Is that correct?
Under the Marta Act, there is no explicit requirement for what we do. Now, what we do is required under government auditing standards, and it's done by every public.
So internal audit is a function?
Internal audit is a function under the government auditing standards, and also is done by every governmental agency.
Okay, thanks.
Including in transit.
The list of audits that you're going to do this next year, you make the decision what goes on that list?
So ultimately, I make the decision what goes on that list, but I never want to make that decision in a vacuum. We have discussions with colleague Greenwood. I've shared already this draft plan with a number of the key executives here for any sort of feedback as to, hey, you've forgotten about this area, why it's not on the audit plan, or this area doesn't seem to be relevant, why is it here? But me being an independent organization, I have to make that final decision, but I never want to do it in a vacuum or sort of kind of going off on my own. This needs to be a collaborative process.
Okay, and I think from a private business standpoint, that's a little strange to me, but I understand the internal audit part of it, because we all do the external audit. I mean, you know, we're required, if you're doing any kind of work at all, you're required to have that, but the internal audit is a little different process for me to understand, but I'm getting there slowly. But one of the things, and I'll ask one last question, has to do with rail car procurement, which is the largest contract we had, and it's on your list of things that you're going to look into. And one of the things that we did really interesting last board meeting was we approved this contract for somebody to watch over and make sure we're getting what we're supposed to be getting from the rail car people. And I'm curious, I mean, I think this board has to understand that the responsibility for whether that happens or not lies here. And I think that's an excellent tool in hiring somebody that's supposed to be watching over these guys to make sure that the design is going like it should have. But it's a $16 million contract that seems to me to be vital to the production of these cars. And where does that fit into what you're doing, or does it?
It does fit into what we're doing. This year we looked at just overall project management infrastructure, if you will. Are the processes in place to kind of lead to a good outcome of what you just described? Next year, next fiscal year, we would actually be looking at the actual invoices that were paid and what was achieved for what was paid. And in the process, typically we'll examine what controls exist to ensure that whoever needs to watch Stadler is watching Stadler. And if Stadler was supposed to get this point in the design and development, that they're at that point in the design and development, or maybe they're a little ahead, or maybe they're a little behind. So it does fit into what we do because as the famous quote from Mark Twain says, it's not what we don't know that hurts us, it's what we know for sure that just ain't so. So we want to know that we know that things are running well, and that's where we come into, that's what internal audit does to a great degree, is verifying that what we think we know is actually happening versus we think we know something, but it's not there. You know, sometimes we illuminate new risks. Hey, we didn't know that this was a problem. But oftentimes where organizations really fail is that they think they have controls, but lo and behold, those controls don't exist. They were canceled, they were removed, or they're just not operating the way they're intended to operate. And that's where internal audit comes in and says, hey, this control doesn't function. You know, you fired the person 3 months ago, now nobody does it.
Okay, thank you very much. And Kylie, I'll just add that I think this little $16 million contract, watching over the people, is something that, as a board, we need to pay attention to on a regular basis. I think it's absolutely essential that we are confident as we go through the next couple of years with these rail cars, that we understand whether they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and that we're getting it with some level of confidence. And that's why I think it's vital that we be kept up to speed on what they're doing, what they're not doing, or what they should be doing that we didn't ask them to do. So that kind of thing. So, okay. I'm sorry I took so long on that, but anyway, Emil, is there anything else?
No, Mr. Floyd, that concludes my presentation.
Okay, are any other matters to come before the audit committee today? All right, let's go.
Thank you.